Antonio's hands trembled as he pressed down on Gabriella's chest. The quiet street was suddenly filled with the roar of engines, and Vincenzo, the Godfather, was charging toward him, fury in his eyes. Antonio had mere seconds to revive her. What happened in the next 30 seconds would change his life forever. And what happened 48 hours later, the whole city would be talking about, forever. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The evening sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement of an empty alley. The scent of diesel and food vendors mixed in the air, giving everything a gritty yet familiar feel. The kind of place where a day could change everything, but you wouldn't know until it was too late. Antonio, just a street kid, had seen it all. He'd lived on the edges, invisible to most, surviving one day at a time. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just the homeless kid in the alley. Today, he was something more. Today, he saved the life of Gabriella, the Godfather's granddaughter. He didn't know it then, but this small act of courage would pull him into a deadly game with the most powerful family in town. Gabriella's life was in his hands, but in the shadow of power, saving her was the start of something much bigger. Something that would haunt Antonio for the rest of his life. Antonio wasn't just a boy anymore. He was now part of something much darker. And what he didn't know was that Vincenzo, the Godfather, would stop at nothing to make sure his family was protected. The choice was now his: follow their dangerous path or risk everything for a future he couldn't see. Antonio had learned the art of disappearing long before he truly understood what it meant to be invisible. He moved through the city like a shadow, never seen, never heard. The streets were his home, the alleyways his sanctuary. He had no family, no place to call his own. Just the sound of his own breath and the shuffle of his worn-out shoes on the cracked pavement. He didn't ask for help. In fact, he never even looked anyone in the eye. Antonio knew better than to draw attention to himself. In a city full of people with their own problems, he was just another face in the crowd, one that barely registered in the minds of the passers-by. No one cared that his stomach was empty or that his clothes were threadbare. Survival was his only goal, and he'd learned the hard way that staying quiet and staying out of sight was the best way to make it through the day. The concrete jungle was unforgiving, but Antonio had adapted. He knew the best places to hide, the spots where the streetlights didn't reach, where no one would notice him sleeping in the corners of alleyways, tucked away from the world. He never lingered too long in one place, always moving, always slipping through unnoticed. He didn't have the luxury of lingering on memories or regrets. He didn't have time for that. His life was a series of simple rules. Don't make noise, don't ask for anything, and don't ever get involved. But it wasn't easy. There were days when the hunger gnawed at him, when the cold seeped into his bones, no matter how tightly he pulled his jacket around himself. Nights when the city seemed to close in, the hum of traffic and distant voices blending into an oppressive silence. Antonio knew the streets better than anyone. He knew the regulars, the drunks, the beggars, the dealers, but he kept his distance from them all. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He often wondered if it was just a matter of time before he disappeared completely. Another face lost to the noise of the world. But that thought never lasted long. He pushed it down, like all the other dark thoughts that threatened to drown him. He'd learned early on that the only way to survive was to keep moving forward. Never stop, never let anyone see the cracks. Antonio hadn't thought much about the world beyond the streets. His universe was small, just the block he roamed, the stores he slipped past, the people he learned to avoid. Life, for him, was a constant game of not being noticed, of being just enough of a blur to slip under the radar, and that's exactly how he intended to stay. Until one afternoon, when everything changed. The sound of the engine was deafening as it roared down the street, a blur of chrome and leather. Antonio barely noticed the bike as it sped past him, his attention caught by something far more urgent. A scream pierced the air, sharp and terrified. Antonio's heart jolted in his chest as he spun toward the sound. There, lying motionless on the asphalt, was a girl, her golden hair splayed out like a halo around her head. Gabriella. The name hit him like a wave of shock. He knew her by sight. She wasn't just anyone. She was the granddaughter of Vincenzo, the Godfather, a name that carried weight in every corner of the city. Antonio's feet moved before his mind could catch up. His hands trembled as he rushed to her side. She wasn't moving. Her chest wasn't rising. He could feel the panic rising in his throat as he knelt beside her. He'd never been in a situation like this before. He was a street kid, no training, no resources, but this wasn't the time to think. It was the time to act. He checked for a pulse, his fingers pressing against her throat, but found nothing. His breath caught. "No," he muttered under his breath. The words of his mother, long buried, came rushing back. "Always help those in need." She'd taught him that once, back when he was a child, before life had turned into the fight for survival that it was now. But this was different. Antonio forced himself to focus. He remembered the basics, things he had seen on TV in passing, before the world had turned its back on him. Kneeling over her, he placed his hands on her chest and pressed down, his heart pounding in his ears. 1, 2, 3. He counted in rhythm, the sound of his palms meeting her lifeless chest echoing in the silence around him. His hands shook with the pressure. Focus. He couldn't afford to mess this up. He glanced up, just for a second, and froze. There, standing at the edge of the street, was a man, tall, imposing, with a hard look in his eyes. Antonio's breath caught. The man was dressed in black, his face hard with a silent fury. Behind him, a group of men in dark suits stood like shadows, eyes trained on him. The Hell's Angels. And they were waiting, watching. Antonio's hands shook even harder as he pressed down again. His chest was tight with fear, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The seconds felt like hours. With every push, he willed her to breathe, willed her to come back to life. Finally, her chest rose with a sudden, shuddering breath. Antonio pulled back, gasping for air as her eyes fluttered open. She was alive. But just as he exhaled in relief, he heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. The man in black was only a few steps away, his cold eyes fixed on Antonio. The tension in the air was palpable, suffocating. Antonio's world had just shifted, and there was no going back. The news spread quickly, as things like this often did in a town where whispers were louder than shouts. By the time Antonio found himself huddled in his usual spot behind the old convenience store, trying to gather the few coins he could, the entire street was buzzing. He could hear snippets of conversation as people passed by. "Did you hear about the boy who saved Gabriella?" "I heard she was dead. Then this kid just brought her back." The words came like a strange echo, bouncing off the cracked walls of the alley. Antonio had never been the center of attention, and now that he was, it felt like a heavy weight on his chest. The thoughts raced in his mind. He had no idea what he had done, what he had started. All he knew was that Gabriella had been in trouble, and in that moment his instinct to act had overpowered everything else. But now, standing in the middle of an invisible storm, he realized that one decision had pulled him into something far bigger than he ever could have imagined. It wasn't long before Vincenzo's men came looking. Antonio had heard their cars pull up outside the small diner earlier that morning, the rumble of their engines enough to send a shiver down his spine. He had recognized them instantly. The hard stares, the way they carried themselves with that dangerous air of men who knew how to control everything around them. They were the Godfather's men, and they weren't here for a casual chat. They were here because of him. The first visit came when Antonio was sitting on a worn-out bench by the bus stop, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The man who approached him wasn't much older than Antonio, but his eyes were cold, empty, like he had seen too many things that had drained him of any warmth. His face was unreadable as he stared down at Antonio, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "Vincenzo wants to meet you," the man said, his voice low but firm. Antonio's stomach twisted. He didn't even know what to say. I don't understand. I just helped her." The man didn't flinch, didn't offer any sympathy. His eyes narrowed, like a predator waiting to strike. "Doesn't matter what you understand, kid," he replied. "The Godfather doesn't take kindly to people messing with his family. But you've got his attention." Antonio felt his heart race. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was tangled up in a world he never asked to be part of, a world where his actions, his very existence, meant something far more dangerous than just surviving the streets. The man didn't wait for Antonio to respond. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty street like a promise of things to come. Antonio sat there for a long time, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The whispers were no longer just idle gossip. They were threats, silent but looming. Vincenzo's attention wasn't something you could just walk away from. It was a force, pulling him into something deeper, darker, and all Antonio could do was wonder just how deep it would go. The knock on the door came late in the evening, as the streetlights flickered their weak light across the alley. Antonio had been half asleep, the dull hum of traffic outside his usual resting place doing little to soothe him. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than the stares of the people who whispered about him on the street. When the knock came, he wasn't surprised. Not really. He had known it was only a matter of time before Vincenzo's men would return, but hearing it, feeling the weight of it in his bones, made the reality set in. The knock echoed through the quiet night like a promise. He rose slowly, his legs stiff from the hours spent on the hard concrete, and walked toward the sound. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he pulled open the door, his breath caught in his throat. Standing there, framed by the dim light of the street, was the same man who had approached him earlier, his expression unreadable. "Vincenzo wants to meet you," the man said. His voice was even, calm, as if meeting the Godfather was as ordinary as any other errand. Antonio swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Vincenzo, the Godfather. He had heard stories about the man, enough to know that his name carried the weight of the city, the power to control everything and everyone in it. Antonio had never dreamed of meeting someone like that, never thought his life would cross paths with such a dangerous figure, and now, here he was, standing at the threshold of the most powerful man in town, a man who could make or break him with a single word. I don't know what I've done," Antonio muttered, his voice barely a whisper, almost lost in the vast silence that surrounded them. The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, watching Antonio with an unreadable expression, then nodded once, his movements slow and deliberate. "Don't worry about that," he said. "Vincenzo just wants to talk." Antonio felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, to explain that he had only done what anyone else might have done in that situation, but the words caught in his mouth. How could he explain that he hadn't known what saving Gabriella would mean? That he hadn't known it would pull him into the orbit of the most dangerous family in the city? "Come on," the man said, stepping aside. "You're expected." Antonio stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He had no choice now, no way to back out. The Godfather wanted him, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped forward, following the man down the darkened street. The silence between them felt thick, suffocating. Each step brought him closer to Vincenzo, closer to a world he had no place in, but was now, inexplicably, part of. He was about to meet the man who ruled the city, and in that moment, Antonio realized that the life he had once known was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The city was alive with noise as Antonio walked through the streets. the headlights of passing cars casting long shadows against the walls of the narrow alleyways. Each step felt like it echoed, the weight of what was about to happen pressing heavily on his chest. He had never been inside a building like this before. The mansion, Vincenzo's home, was imposing, its dark stone walls towering above him, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. The kind of place where power lived, where fear lingered just beneath the surface. As they entered the building, the air seemed thicker, the kind of silence that made Antonio's skin prickle. He didn't speak, didn't even dare to look up at the men who stood guard at every corner. The way they watched him made him feel like an intruder. But he didn't belong here, not in this world. Still, there was no turning back now. The man who had escorted him didn't speak either, simply leading him through the grand halls with quiet precision. Finally, they stopped in front of a large door, and the man gave a short nod before pushing it open. Inside, Vincenzo sat behind a massive desk, his presence filling the room like a storm waiting to break. The Godfather was everything the rumors had promised: powerful, calm, and dangerous. His eyes were dark, calculating, his face lined with years of decisions, each one weighing more than the last. There was a moment of silence as he looked Antonio over, sizing him up, as though considering whether this boy had the strength to withstand what was about to come. "You're the one who saved my granddaughter," Vincenzo said, his voice smooth, low, but with an edge that made the words feel like a command. "Gabriella speaks highly of you. You did something most wouldn't dare." Antonio stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had no idea what to say. He hadn't done it for anyone but Gabriella. He hadn't expected any reward, least of all this. Vincenzo continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And because of that, I'm going to offer you something most people would kill for." Antonio swallowed, his throat dry. I don't understand." Vincenzo leaned forward, his fingers steepled together, his gaze unflinching. "Protection, power, a place in my world. You'll never go hungry again, never be without a roof over your head, and more than that, you'll have something to show for your life. You'll have status, something you've never had." Antonio could feel his heart racing. The weight of the offer hung in the air between them, the promise of a life he had only ever dreamed of. But there was a catch, he knew that much. Vincenzo's offers always came with a price. "What's the cost?" Antonio asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Vincenzo smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Antonio's stomach twist. "Everything. You'll work for me. You'll do as I say, and in return, you'll be protected. But cross me, and you'll have nothing. No life, no future. Just a memory of someone who should have known better." The room felt colder now, the weight of the Godfather's gaze pressing down on Antonio's chest. He could feel the gravity of the decision hanging over him, the uncertainty clawing at his insides. The offer was tempting, more than anything Antonio had ever known, but the cost. The cost was something he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. But in a world like his, where survival was all that mattered, maybe there was no choice. The days that followed felt like a strange blur. Antonio moved through the city with a heightened awareness, as if the very air had changed around him. The whispering voices in the streets seemed louder now, like the wind carried more than just words. They carried judgment, suspicion. Everyone noticed him. They noticed the way the men in suits watched him from street corners, the way the black cars seemed to follow him wherever he went. At first, he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that the city was still the same, that nothing had really changed. But deep down, Antonio knew better. The Godfather's world wasn't something you could step into without consequences. And now, Vincenzo's men were everywhere. Silent, observing, like shadows at the edge of his vision. Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for him to slip, to make a mistake, so they could swoop in and claim him as their own. He couldn't go anywhere without feeling their eyes on him. The old lady at the corner store didn't look at him the same anymore. She didn't smile. Instead, her eyes flicked nervously to the men standing by the sidewalk, their hands tucked into their pockets, their faces hard. Even the kids who had once ignored him now watched him from a distance, their whispers sharp, knowing. He had once been invisible, and now he was the center of attention, but it wasn't the kind he wanted. It wasn't the kind anyone would want. His every move was watched, analyzed. The tension inside him was growing, building with each passing day. Antonio couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without feeling a knot in his stomach. Every time he passed a darkened alley, he half expected someone to jump out at him. Every time a black car pulled up behind him, he wondered if it was them. If it was Vincenzo's men, here to remind him who he belonged to. It wasn't just the mob that was making things worse. It was the way the town reacted. Word had spread quickly about Antonio's new association, and the once quiet streets now buzzed with fear. The neighborhood that had ignored him for years now watched him closely, some with suspicion, others with pity. The ones who had once passed him by without a second glance now looked at him with a kind of quiet horror, like they could see the change in him even if he hadn't yet acknowledged it himself. Even Gabriella, the girl he had saved, seemed different when he saw her. She no longer smiled at him the way she had before. She looked at him like he was someone else, someone different, someone dangerous, and the worst part was, he didn't know if she was afraid of him or of what he had become. The unease gnawed at him, a constant undercurrent to his every thought. He wasn't the same Antonio anymore. The city knew it, the mob knew it, and maybe, just maybe, even he knew it. The weight of the Godfather's world was on his shoulders, and it was suffocating. The tension had been building for weeks, the weight of it pressing down on Antonio like the city itself was suffocating him. Every step, every glance, felt like it could be his last. Vincenzo's men were always there, always watching, always waiting, and now it was clear that the Godfather's grip on him was tightening, closing in, until he couldn't move without their fingers on his back. It all came to a head one evening, when the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Antonio had been walking through the streets, his thoughts consumed by the strange weight of his new life, when he was pulled into a darkened alley. Before he could react, he was face to face with one of Vincenzo's men. A hard-faced figure whose name he didn't know, but whose reputation he had heard all too well. "You've been given a lot, Antonio," the man said, his voice low, gravelly. "Protection, power. But nothing comes for free, you know that. Vincenzo doesn't do favors." Antonio's heart started to race, panic setting in. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice shaky, but he already knew that it didn't matter. His words didn't change the fact that he was already tangled in something too big for him to untangle himself from. The man smiled coldly. "You didn't have a choice." Antonio felt a pit open up in his stomach. He knew somehow that what the man was about to say would change everything. "The Godfather has a problem," the man continued, his gaze piercing. "A loose end. Someone who's been talking. We need you to take care of it." Antonio's blood ran cold. He had heard the rumors. Vincenzo had enemies, people who wanted to bring him down, and some of them were close. Too close. The idea that someone within the Godfather's family was betraying him was terrifying, and the thought that Vincenzo would ask him, Antonio, a boy who had just tried to survive, to fix it, was worse. "You want me to kill someone?" Antonio's voice barely registered. It was so weak. The man's expression didn't change. "You're smart enough to figure it out. Do what needs to be done. The Godfather doesn't tolerate weakness, Antonio. And if you fail, well, you know what happens to those who fail." The weight of it crashed into Antonio like a tidal wave. The choice, the decision, had never felt heavier. He had thought his life was complicated before, but now the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. To turn his back on Vincenzo, to refuse the task, what would that mean? Would he be killed for his disobedience? Would the people he cared about suffer? But if he did what they asked, if he became the instrument of their revenge, Could he ever live with himself? Could he survive in this world where betrayal was currency, where loyalty meant blood? Antonio's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to figure out who he wanted to be. But no matter how much he fought it, the decision was already being made for him. In Vincenzo's world, there were no easy choices, no escape. And Antonio was starting to realize that survival was a game he might lose, no matter which path he took. The night was still, the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified. Antonio stood in the middle of the street, his heart pounding in his chest as the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The weight of his decision was heavy in his gut, the pressure in the air thick with anticipation. He had tried to ignore the pull of the mob, tried to convince himself that he could still walk away, but the reality was inescapable. The moment had arrived. A black car rolled to a stop at the end of the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The engine hummed to a quiet stop, and the door swung open. Two of Vincenzo's men stepped out, their dark suits blending into the night. Antonio's stomach twisted. He recognized them both, had seen them lurking in the shadows for weeks, their cold eyes always on him. The taller one stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Vincenzo wants to see you." Antonio swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. His body felt frozen, his legs like lead. He didn't want to go with them, didn't want to face the Godfather. But he knew there was no turning back. The decision had already been made for him. The two men flanked him as they walked, their eyes scanning the street, their presence unsettling. The further they walked, the more Antonio's nerves stretched thin. The streetlights cast long, jagged shadows, making the night feel even more oppressive, as if the very air around him was suffocating. He could hear the distant sounds of the city, the low hum of cars, but everything felt muffled, as if he was hearing it through water. They reached the old building, Vincenzo's mansion, its dark stone walls looming like a fortress. Antonio's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, but his body moved on autopilot, as if it was no longer his to command. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The room was large, grand even, but there was an oppressive air to it, a coldness that made everything feel foreboding. Vincenzo sat at his desk, his eyes locked on Antonio as he entered, his gaze sharp, calculating. The Godfather's presence filled the room, heavy and intimidating. "Sit," Vincenzo said, his voice smooth, but carrying a weight of authority that made Antonio's muscles stiffen. Antonio hesitated for a moment before taking a seat, the chair cold under him, the silence stretching between them like a thick fog. Vincenzo's eyes never left him, and Antonio could feel the pressure building, the weight of expectation hanging in the air. "You've been given a choice, Antonio," Vincenzo said, his voice low but firm. "You've been given protection, power. You've been welcomed into my family, but you've also been given a test." Antonio's stomach churned. He knew what was coming. He had known all along. This wasn't about loyalty or protection. It was about control, and the price for that control was steep. "Now you must decide," Vincenzo continued, his tone never wavering. "Will you fight for your freedom, or will you submit to the life I've offered you? You can walk away from all of this, but you know the cost. You know what happens to those who refuse me." Antonio's breath caught in his throat. He had seen it all, the power, the fear, the way people bowed down to Vincenzo's will, but he wasn't like them. He wasn't like the men who had already given in to the mob, and yet the thought of walking away, of refusing the Godfather, sent a shiver down his spine. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Antonio could feel the weight of Vincenzo's gaze, the weight of his own decision pressing down on him. What was the right choice? Was there even a right choice at all? He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. The time to decide had come, and Antonio knew deep down that whatever he chose would change him forever. The decision had been made. Antonio stood at the edge of everything he had known, everything he had been. The weight of Vincenzo's world pressed down on him like 1,000 tons of concrete. He had chosen, hadn't he? He had walked this path, had let the Godfather's power wrap its tendrils around him, and now there was no escaping it. The days blurred together after that meeting. The streets felt colder, even though summer was still in the air, and the town, his town, seemed to shift under the weight of what had happened. The whispers grew louder. They followed him everywhere he went, clinging to the corners of the alleyways, spilling out from the mouths of the townsfolk. Antonio, the boy who saved Gabriella, was now part of Vincenzo's world, and no one could forget it. He had become a shadow in his own life, just another cog in the machine that turned the city's heart. Vincenzo's men watched his every move. They guided him, subtly at first, with the promise of protection, but the price was clear. The jobs, the favors, the work, they piled up until Antonio felt suffocated by it all. He had learned quickly that there was no room for weakness, no space for hesitation in this world. You either took what was given or you were discarded. The worst part was that, for a time, it didn't feel all that bad. There were moments when he could almost convince himself that he was doing the right thing. The power, the respect, it was intoxicating. He was no longer the invisible kid in the alley. People looked at him now. They spoke to him. They knew his name. And for the first time, Antonio felt like he mattered, like he wasn't just an echo fading into the background of a city that had never cared about him. But as the days passed, something else began to stir inside him, a quiet resistance. He saw the damage, the destruction left behind by the decisions made in dark corners, in smoke-filled rooms. He saw the fear in people's eyes when they looked at him, the way they avoided his gaze, knowing who he had become, what he was becoming. It was the cost of power, he realized, and the price was more than he could bear. It wasn't long before the cracks started to show. The things he had once done without a second thought now weighed on him, their consequences gnawing at his conscience. Antonio could feel the darkness closing in. The grip of the mob, Vincenzo's world, was suffocating him. The choice, the one he had made so many weeks ago, wasn't as clear anymore. He couldn't escape, not in any meaningful way, not without leaving behind everything, his past, his future, everything he had built since that day he saved Gabriella. But he could still fight. He could still make a choice. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all he had. One night, when the city lay quiet under the weight of its secrets, Antonio made his move. He walked away from the mansion, from Vincenzo's shadow, from everything that had come to define him. The streets were still filled with whispers, but now Antonio was running towards something, anything, that wasn't part of the mob's world. The town would never be the same. Antonio would never be the same. The Godfather's reach would always stretch far and wide, but for the first time in his life, Antonio was free. Free to choose who he would become, free to carve out a life that wasn't bound by blood and power. The decision had cost him, but it had also set him free. And in that, Antonio knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a boy.